All right. So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Michael Molina. I'm the Workforce Development Coordinator at Southern Plains Transportation Center, also librarian for Oklahoma Department of Transportation. Thank you for joining our SPTC webinar series. This is our long-running webinar series we try to put on every month or so, touching on different topics that touch the transportation community and researchers and our stakeholders. Today we have a very special guest, James Grimsley, with us. Before we get into his presentation, I'd like to touch on a few housekeeping rules. Specifically, if you attend the full hour, you're going to get one full professional development hour if you need that for your professional license. Also, we'll be recording this session and posting it online on our website. So if you miss any of it or want to share it with someone else, don't worry, we'll have a link to that as well. We're also going to send out a survey after the event so you can let us know how we did. And if there's any other topics you might be interested in, let us know. We're always interested in what the community would like to see as far as future programming. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our special guest today. He is James Grimsley. He serves as the Executive Director for Advanced Technology Initiatives with the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and is a Regional Innovation Officer for the Texoma Semiconductor Tech Hub led by SMU. He's a former Oklahoma Transportation Commissioner with oversight and governance responsibilities for ODOT. And Mr. Grimsley currently serves on the board of directors for the Commercial Drone Alliance, as well as a variety of other boards and advisory groups. As part of his Choctaw Nation duties, he currently manages the FAA Beyond program, which is the Choctaw Nation's only tribal lead participant in the Beyond program, and he previously managed the FAA Integration Pilot program for the Choctaw Nation. That is a very busy schedule that he has going on. So he's going to share with us today about leveraging emerging aviation technologies to improve safety and quality of life in rural tribal communities. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Grimsley.
So thank you. Yes, thank you, Mike. I'm actually participating south of the border. I'm in Texas on the SMU campus today. So my background is blurred. I don't think you see anything that's SMU, but I am a Sooner. My degrees from OU and very much love the university. I worked there several years. So let me go ahead and pull up my presentation. Let's see if we get that going. Can everybody see this?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay, so you covered some of this. This is my background. If you ever met the kid growing up that didn't know what they wanted to be when they grew up, that's me. A lot of the things in my career have been more accidental than intentional. Things like joining the Transportation Commission. I never thought I would ever be involved in asphalt and concrete and things like that, ground transportation, but I ended up serving for a few years, basically through political connections and things that happened. But it actually helped shape some of my opinions and insights into some of the challenges that we have in aviation. So all of these things kind of, the thing about if you have career broadening experiences are usually a good thing because they can help broaden what you think about and what you do. So primarily my career is focused on aviation. So I grew up in the heart of the Choctaw Reservation, grew up in Atoka County. Both sides of my family go back multiple generations. I have so many Choctaw cousins, I can't keep track of, what level of cousin they are. Growing up, my mom would always try to explain how I was related to people, and I would get, my eyes would glaze over because both sides of my family had been there many, many years from a really small area. And so I'm related to probably half of Atoka County, if the numbers were actually ran. But I grew up in a time when it was very, very poor. When I was growing up there weren't any resources. It was some of the highest unemployment in the country. And we suffered from regional generational poverty. And that it had been that way for a long time. The Choctaws were forcibly relocated back in the 1830s or so. So, for the first 150 years of the Choctaws' existence there in the reservation, things were not great financially. Generational poverty has a lot of ills that come with it, everything from bad diets to addiction problems. So just a plethora of things usually come along with that type of generational challenge like that. So I grew up as a little kid watching the Apollo missions on a black and white television, watching it live. And I just thought it would be so neat to be one of those men or women that made that happen. I thought that would be so neat to figure that out. And I remember I would watch the live transmissions and the broadcasts, and I would go sit outside and just think about it, what it would be like. Never dreaming that I would get to go be an aerospace engineer and then eventually come back and be doing, advanced aviation research right where I grew up. So it's been kind of a cool thing. So the Choctaws, the third largest federally recognized Native American tribe, it's with over 230,000 enrolled members right now. So it's growing, obviously, um, as a lot of people, may not be enrolled now, but they go back and they trace the Dawes rolls, they can add stuff like that. The Choctaws' original homeland, the ancestral homeland, was around Mississippi. So it's, almost think of it as the state of Mississippi was the original kind of ancestral homeland of the people. That started getting whittled away by treaties. The federal government would come in and say, we need this little piece, we need this little piece. And then that culminated in the federal government coming in saying, we want the entire area. You're going to have to leave. And so as part of the treaty negotiations, the chief of the Choctaw Nation was able to travel out to what is modern day Oklahoma. It was Indian Territory at the time, and find a reservation. And he settled on the southeastern portion because it had a lot of natural resources that was similar to what they had. There are a lot of forests. If you've ever been to southeastern Oklahoma, on the far western side, we kind of start moving from the plains that we think of in Oklahoma, and then when we get to the eastern boundary along Arkansas, it's looking more like the Ozarks. We start to get the rolling hills of the Ozarks and stuff. Of course, no one would have fought ahead in the 1830 to realize that the reservation would sit literally next door to the fastest growing really regional economy in the United States, which is the DFW and Texoma area. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex is slated to be the second largest metro area in the United States by 2030, and it's not slowing down. It's amazing what's happened here. So the reservation itself is 11,000 square miles. It's interesting. It's a little bigger than one or two states, I think, but it's an interesting size. And if you've ever been to Singapore, it's just an amazing country and what they can get done in terms of how they've tackled unemployment. It's just their economy's great, all these things they've done. But you also walk away realizing that it would be difficult for them to have done that if it was any bigger. And I think the same thing is true, that the reservation is just the right size. The tribe has the right time, resources, all these things came together, but the reservation itself is the right size and allows the tribe to do things that might be more difficult if the state of Oklahoma or the state of Texas tried to do something like that. So one of the things that we have done is we recognize that the sovereignty comes into play in a lot of ways. And I was at the University of Oklahoma at the time when the tribe reached out to me and told me that they had bought a very large tract of property. And I knew the property. My great grandmother was born on that property. My family's from there. I used to hunt and fish as a kid on the property that they were talking about. But they had a very simple proposition. They wanted to know if that property could be used for aviation, something like aviation testing. My initial reaction was I was a little skeptical because there was just really no infrastructure, not a lot of stuff there. But I started talking to friends at the time in the White House and OSTP and some friends at NASA, and very quickly realized that there was something significant because the tribal sovereignty, the way the treaties are written, gave them some interesting things that they could do. And we started to realize that they had an opportunity to help unlock some of the regulatory gridlock that we're facing in aviation, especially emerging aviation. So out of the bat, one of the things that happened right as soon as the Trump administration, the first Trump administration came in, was the president created what was called the Integration Pilot Program. And we had been working across administration. I was working with the Obama administration, then Trump, and then we've had a pretty seamless handover between all the administrations, including the current Trump administration. And so at that time, the Choctaws had no name recognition, brand recognition, or people weren't even really aware. People didn't really associate the Choctaw Nation with technology. But we did go after and pursue one of the IPP sites. We won, and it created a significant amount of public attention in a very good way because it showed what the tribe can do in terms of technology innovation, that we can lead and we can leverage sovereignty in ways that benefit all of the country and all of society. So we did win. We were the only tribal government to win and be selected. And that just set up almost dominoes of what we were able to do. And I'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later in the presentation, but that really got us going. And one of the things that we do have is we are building a true dedicated physical test site. This is not an administrative construct. This is a true test site that mirrors what the military can do in restricted airspace in some of the military test ranges. So a little background on the Choctaw Nation. It is interesting growing up in the reservation because I never delineated when I was growing up our local culture and Choctaw culture. That's just the way we were. And if you've ever spent a lot of time in southeastern Oklahoma, the people are very generous. They're very kind, very empathetic. They very friendly. The sense of humor is unique, and I never really associated a lot of that with the Choctaw culture until I'd left and came back and started to realize that we were living in the Choctaw culture. That was our culture. But one of the neat stories is right after the tribe had been forcibly relocated on the Trail of Tears over to Oklahoma, what was modern day Oklahoma. That the whole journey was very, very difficult. They basically had to take what they could carry, right? You know, it was a very difficult journey. We don't know exactly how many of the Choctaw people died on the journey. We think somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 because people were buried as they died and where they fell, and the graves weren't marked. And so the estimate is 4,000 to 6,000, but we're not exactly sure. But as the journey went on, got to Mississippi, you couldn't carry, you know, whatever clothes you had on, what you can physically carry is all you had. A lot of the tribal members had the foresight to sow a lot of the heirloom seeds, you know, the crops that they had developed over years and really managed. They had the foresight to actually sow those seeds in their clothing to make sure that they survived and they could get them out, because that was very important. The agricultural traditions that the tribe had developed, they really wanted to maintain those. And if you look at this painting that's on the left there, just after the Choctaws arrived, as they were coming over, they started hearing the stories of what was happening in Ireland. There was, and if you've ever learned about the Irish famine, it was horrible. Many people starved to death. And the Choctaws at that time really had nothing. They just lost their homeland. They were trying to rebuild, and they had literally nothing. But they were so moved when they heard the story. I think it was the federal soldiers were the ones that told them about it. Said, you know, you don't know what's going on in Ireland. It's horrible over there. They collectively raised, at that time, it was like $170, which for people who really had nothing was a whole lot of money. And they sent that to Ireland, and the Irish have never forgotten it. And it created this really neat cultural bond between Ireland and the Choctaw people. I was fortunate last summer to go on a visit with the lieutenant governor and several of us, and went to Ireland, spent a little bit over a week there. And in both Ireland and the Choctaw Nation, we have duplicate monuments. It's called the Kindred Spirits Monument. You can see on the right, that's me standing next to the one just outside of Cork in Ireland. They're very beautiful. These steel monuments and structures at night, they're amazingly beautiful because the lighting is different colors, and the way it sets up is just really cool. But all across the country, when I would tell people I was representing the Choctaw Nation, everyone knows who the Choctaw Nation is, who the people are. And it was so friendly, but it's an interesting cultural bond. We just had leadership from Ireland out a couple of weeks ago. And so there's constantly these visits that go back and forth, but it really describes the Choctaw people. And when they had nothing, they were generous to an unbelievable degree. Now that they have resources, they're still generous, and it really hasn't changed the people. They're still the same generous, empathetic people that understand hardship. They plan for the future. They think long term, and
There you go.
and it's pretty neat. So, can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Okay, make sure. Good. Okay, so kind of switching gears for a second. So this is a common problem we have in the United States, and this is rural areas in general. So if you think about when we started building like our highway networks and stuff, you know, we didn't really necessarily have long-term plans. And we started building, you know, highways over 100 years ago at the national level, you know, the federal government looking at designating highways and building things. And we've built out a pretty massive road network in the United States. But what happens is that road network is very expensive. In rural areas, typically just because of the population, the way the funding allocations work, it doesn't necessarily favor regions that don't have high populations. And it was something I fought, tried to fight really strongly when I was on the commission, is that, if you look at these areas, typically the rural areas are underfunded. Now, in general, our entire transportation network is underfunded. We have so many billions of dollars in deferred maintenance, deferred construction, all sorts of things. So in general, our road networks we have a lot to invest in, a lot to do. But I didn't really pay that much attention to really the ground transportation. I thought that's what the civil engineers did. I was an aerospace engineer, right? But one of the things that started to get my attention was, in aviation, we take accidents very seriously. We have zero tolerance for aviation accidents. Every time there's an accident, we study it, make sure that never happens again, or the lessons learned. But what was different as I became a commissioner is I would get those random calls any time of day or whatever. The commissioner, we've had to close a highway. A couple of people died in a fatality accident. And they weren't calling me because I could do anything about it. It wasn't like I was of any help. They were calling me because my name and number was on the website. And when people get mad about problems in traffic, they call the commissioner. They would just give me a heads up. But I would hear this, I thought, oh my gosh, that's horrible. 2 or 3 people have died. And then I would notice that a lot of times it never even made the news. It might make a little local newspaper or something, but it didn't, there wasn't a lot of attention paid to it. And I started to realize how bad things were on the ground compared to the air. And as I started to study it and really read up on it and learn about that, we have somewhere 44,000 or 43,000. We have this high number of fatalities happening every year, but there's really no public reaction to it. There's no outcry. We don't have people protesting at the side of the highway saying shut down the roadways because transportation is too deadly. If we had that level of fatalities in aviation would be shut down. We wouldn't have an aviation system. And it really struck me that for some reason we have a different tolerance on the ground. But if you look at what's happened, there's a lot of problems. Sometimes it's roadways. There's a lot of factors that deal with that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But in general, rural areas don't have a good outlook in the future for modernizing our highways, upgrading them. Just adding modest shoulders is so expensive. A lot of the rural areas have blind corners, blind curves, all sorts of things that are deadly. And having that experience as a commissioner, first of all, having to deal with the budget, and realizing there's not enough money, as well as just constantly hearing all this fatality information, really started to change. So one of the things I started looking at was what do the highway deaths look like per year? And here is something that goes back to, I think, maybe right around the 20s or earlier. So this is roughly 100 years of accidents. And I'll show something on aviation in a second, but if you look at each of these accidents, so suppose we're, in the low 40s on fatalities, 43,000 or something like that. The Department of Transportation actually has this actuarial process where they assess the value of a life. It's called the value of statistical life. That if one of us goes out, we die prematurely, unexpectedly in traffic or something, there's a cost or an impact to society. And that cost and impact could be our family, it could be our employer, all sorts of things. Life insurance has to pay out, but there's this cost. And on average, that cost when a person dies is $13.7 million. So if you look at $13.7 million, and then you multiply that by 40 something thousand deaths a year, you start to realize that we have this massive recurring sort of a loss to society. It's an impact that represents a loss that's on the order of $500 billion a year. And it happens every single year. And you start to realize this is a pretty significant thing. Not even if you just, kind of separating out the emotional and all the devastating effects it has on family and friends and things like that. Just that tangible impact on society is pretty significant. So in Oklahoma, we have 65% of our traffic fatalities happen on rural roadways, even though only 35% of the population lives in a rural area. And so there's a lot of reasons: the road conditions, you're farther from a trauma center if you are in an accident, you're farther from, treatment. Sometimes in urban areas, you can receive treatment at the right facility or trauma center very quickly and receive life-saving measures that may not be possible in a rural area. And so there's a lot of reasons, but that's a disproportionate amount where you're on the order of twice the chances of dying on a rural highway and a rural accident. And this is significant. I've known far too many people. My son almost died almost 15 years ago on a rural highway with no shoulders, just a typical scenario. Got too close to the edge, car flips, goes down a ravine, lands on top of a tree, and he spent many weeks in ICU and has a lot of metal in his body as a result. So I've personally lived through this. And so being the engineer I am, we like to just continually manipulate numbers until we get meaning out of that. And so as I started to look at it, ground transportation does a pretty good job of risk calculating the value of a risk and then looking at investments to avoid that risk. And if you take that number, that $13.7 million, and then you look at statistically a place like the Choctaw Nation, a rural area, that right now there's somewhere around 1.68 traffic fatalities per 100 million miles driven. So it's much higher than an urban area. But if you take that 1.68 per 100 million miles driven, and then you look at that 13.7 million, and I think that's the latest number, they update it every year or two in the USDOT, that works out to somewhere around 23 cents a mile. That what happens is we're sort of accruing that tax. It's a phantom fatality tax is what I call it. That whenever we get in our automobile, if we don't have an accident or whatever, statistically, we're pretty consistent with those fatalities happening. What happens is in a sense, we're accruing a tax. And if we start to treat it, look at it like that, then we start to say just driving on that roadway, there's a cost associated with it. If we ignore maintenance of the road, we ignore maintenance of our vehicles, depreciation, the fuel for our vehicles, if we ignore all those things, there's this other tax that we're accruing. And right now it's somewhere around 23 cents per mile in a rural area like the Choctaw Nation. That changes how you look at things economically, especially if you're looking at other modes of transportation. If you're looking at curbing demand by looking at another mode of transportation, this becomes very important because using numbers like this allows us to economically assess and evaluate how bad it is, and we can more quantifiably and more objectively evaluate alternatives. And so this is one of the things I've been working on as we look at these alternatives like drone delivery versus couriers on the road, things like that. This becomes very important because this is how we justify, first of all, doing it, but it also justifies the investment in infrastructure that's needed to do that. And typically what we look at is we can build out the infrastructure that we need for things like drone delivery at a minuscule level compared to what we have to do to bring our roadways up to the level in the future that we're going to need to. And in all reality, there's not enough money on the horizon to bring our entire national road network up to the level that we would all think is safe and modern. It's just none. I think we all realize that there's not going to be many more trillion-dollar infrastructure bailout type deals that we can do at the federal level. Our federal debt is burgeoning, and we just are not going to see a lot of opportunities. That means we have to think very judiciously, very efficiently in the future how we look at this. Another thing that happens in urban versus rural areas. So if you're in Oklahoma City or Dallas or Tulsa, an ambulance can get to your house. Suppose you have a heart condition, you have a heart attack, you have something happen. An ambulance can be at your house fairly quickly, a lot of times within that window where your life can be saved and the right aid can be administered. That's not the case in rural areas. And even though the average is 20 to 30 minutes, there are many places in the Choctaw Nation where an ambulance might take an hour to get to you. So it can be a long time. And a lot of times what that means is that becomes a death sentence, that just because you don't get that right care, that right treatment at the right time within the right window, that basically you're not going to recover. You probably are going to die from it. And the line I like to say is that in modern day United States of America, in 21st century United States of America, unfortunately, our zip codes are still a very reliable indicator and predictor of our health outcomes, our fatalities, our mortality. And that's something that is all transportation related because it has to do with distance away from things and the ability to get to things, get to places. And so it's an access problem is what drives that disparity between the rural and the urban outcomes with health and things like that. So switching to aviation, which is my background, my career. So when we started flying 120 years ago with powered flight, aviation was very dangerous. Just getting in or on one of these early contraptions meant that you had a 1 in 3 chance of dying or something. It was very, very high. So we had very high fatality rates early on and accident rates. But society looked at that. There's always an apprehension of things flying above us, or if we're in the air, we're a little bit more apprehensive about it. And as a society, we developed a very high expectation for what we wanted in aviation. And what's happened is, even though with ground transportation, we've saw that curve go way up in the early 70s, and then it started going back up again a few years ago, mainly because of distracted driving and the human element and the human fallacies on it. Aviation, we have systematically been cutting that down, and we had a 16-year stretch, unfortunately, that ended with the DCA accident a year or so ago. But before that, we had a 16-year stretch where we had no commercial fatalities. When I first got my aerospace engineering degree, we were dealing with aging aircraft. We were looking at increasing demand on our national airspace system in terms of people flying, the amount of air traffic that was happening. I thought we might have been at the pinnacle of safety then, because I thought it was going to get worse, not better. I thought there's going to be a lot of problems that compound. What I didn't take into account as an engineer was all the things that happened in the 90s, where we started saying, okay, we're doing good on the technology, but let's look at human factors. Let's look at communication in the cockpit. Let's look at crew resource management. And when we started to look at the human factors and the human side of things over that decade, we've made remarkable improvements in safety. And so what we've done is we've developed this culture in aviation that's very safe. We don't tolerate accidents. Any accident that results in a fatality is an investigation. Something is going to change. There will be an outcome from that investigation, that either we change training, we update training, we do something, but every fatality is taken seriously, and we address it and make sure that it doesn't happen again. And I used to always include pictures in my slides of early World War One and even earlier aircraft and accidents. And for some reason, they ended up in the tops of trees, and they were always crashing into chicken coops. I could never figure that one out, but I have a ton of pictures of the old biplanes, fabric wing aircraft crashing into chicken coops. But in the modern world right now, we worry more about what seat we're going to get on the aircraft, if it's going to be comfortable, or we're going to get there on time, and will our luggage make it. We don't even really think about safety anymore. We almost take it for granted. And that is a remarkable achievement for an industry. That's why I think we need to be looking at aviation as the model and the mode that we look forward on. So a little bit more about the Choctaw Nation. So started having the initial discussions back in 2016 with the tribe about getting into this. And then we had a series of events happen. The tribe was selected for the UAS Integration Pilot Program in 2018. That turned into another program that Secretary Chow at the time had created, U.S. DOT Secretary, called the Beyond Program. That then turned into the Beyond Phase 2 program, which we entered into those agreements a couple of years ago. And then back in December, the Choctaw Nation became one of the official UAS test sites. There's a limited number that allowed by statute. There was a window where they were going to increase that by a couple of test sites, and both Indiana, the state of Indiana, and the Choctaw Nation won. We're the first and only recipient so far of what's called the Section 920B3 waiver. We can self-certify aircraft for our own test operations within our range and things like that, which is a pretty big deal. We were the first tribe to be recognized as a public aircraft operator, which carries a lot of things with it. And right now, we are one of the most sophisticated ranges outside of the military, outside of the DOW in the country, and with one of the biggest regulatory relief toolboxes, which is pretty neat. So anyway, we came from nowhere, where people were even having trouble spelling Choctaw, to a point where now it's a recognized brand and a highly trusted brand and reputation in emerging aviation and in aviation in general. So what we've done is we have built out a pretty modern campus. I think a few of you on the call have been able to visit. We started with what we call phase 0. We built some hangars, we built some other things just to get going. And the pictures you see on this slide is what we call our Emerging Aviation Technology Center. It's the phase 1 campus, and it includes everything from a 10-unit RV park with all the amenities. We have one building to the left. Originally, it was going to be a makerspace. Right now, it's being used as a hangar. Eventually, it will be a makerspace. It'll be more of a high-tech park because we do have a fabrication facility in a makerspace about a half mile south of this on the property. This will be the more high-tech where we're working with electronics. But there's so much demand right now for space at our test range. Contractors are wanting to basically lease these facilities. So we paused any of our construction efforts or plans for that one so that contractors can use it for their operations. The building on the right is our 3-story operations center. That's where administrative offices are, our remote operations command center, which is where we control all the flights within the Choctaw Nation. It's almost like a little mini air traffic control. It's there on that second floor east side. It has a clean high bay, a huge flex space in the bottom for classes, courses, meetings. And then we have a few unique features about it. We have a third floor, what we call a VIP observation lounge, where a lot of times companies will bring their CEO out because they want to see the first flight or they want to see something happen that's to them is very momentous. And so we have created an environment for that where people can actually come watch the flights and have kind of a nice closed environment to do that. As engineers, we made sure that every portion of the building is usable. Every roof is accessible because we put instruments out, we put observers, we do all sorts of things. So it's a very functional building. It's what you would think of as being designed by engineers. We have multiple landing sites too. I have some slides later on if we have time to show those. So one of the neat things about the Choctaw Nation is that we do own, manage, and control our own healthcare system. We have a really nice campus, a hospital campus with all kinds of facilities in Talihina, but we also have a network of clinics, roughly around 12, but those are growing because we're building smaller, like teleclinics and all sorts of things throughout the reservation. So we are a completely self-contained healthcare system. We also have our own pharmacy system. It's private within the Choctaw Nation, where we serve both tribal members and our employees, our associates, with free prescriptions and access to that. So we have all the different elements of healthcare. What that means is that we have a lot of our own employees and a lot of our own tribal members and patients driving around on dangerous roads. They're driving around on these rural highways with no shoulders, all the issues that I talked about earlier. And that's something we think about, we're concerned about. And so one of the first use cases as we started looking about the things that we could do, because we see ourselves on 2 different levels. One is we're involved in the national level. We're working with all sorts of companies to test aircraft, helping with the rulemaking. We serve on all sorts of FAA committees. We're very active with the FAA trying to enable the future regulatory system. But we also are looking for opportunities within our own reservation, how we use this technology to solve real problems. And so one of the first ones that immediately rose to the top was healthcare, how we can use things like drones and some of this emerging technology to address some of these disparities and issues that we have with healthcare. So we did win a USDOT SMART grant, and to basically do the stage 1 we're still in the stage 1, but basically we're looking at the viability of using drones to deliver blood samples between clinics. And so the first 2 clinics we're working with are McAllister and Toka, roughly 43-mile distance between the 2. And what we're looking at is basically what happens a lot of times is, one, it can be either too expensive to put the same equipment in every single clinic, or what happens is, we all know frequently equipment breaks down. And so even though a clinic might have a machine, some test capability, it may be down for a variety of reasons. What we do now is, unfortunately, we do one of 2 things. We either put a patient, say, go get in your car, go drive another 40 miles to this clinic, or 50 miles, go do this, or we put people on the road where they're driving around in tribal vehicles, but they're delivering things as couriers between that. So what we're looking at is the ability to much more expeditiously, faster, move these types of things between clinics. Ultimately, we're looking at things like prescriptions, equipment, things like that we can move back and forth. But in terms of the routine care, one of the immediate ones that we saw a need for was blood samples, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that we can get results to our tribal members quickly, get these accurate results done, so that, as we all know, the earlier we get results back, the more expeditiously we can begin treatment or address situations. And so that timeliness is always important. And so this is one of the first things that we realized that was important. So it involves robot dogs, because we want to come up with a totally contactless system. But more importantly, in the future, we realize a lot of situations we're not going to have a sufficient ground crew somewhere to do safety. So we're looking at this teaming between ground robotics and things like that, as well as the drones, to actually make it safe and secure where we land, where we operate. So there's multiple layers of reasons why we do this. So you can see the picture here. This is the and that picture is the Assistant Secretary of Tribal Affairs for the U.S. DOT, James Crawford. Stan, one of the gentlemen that's over the SMART program from U.S. DOT, he's Chief Batten over toward the right. Chief Batten actually came from the healthcare side. That's how he started with the tribe, is working and leading a lot of the healthcare initiatives within the tribe. So he's very, very familiar, but also very deeply committed to looking at improving the delivery of healthcare within the reservation. He loves this program. He loves technology as well. So it's kind of that good blend that the Chief Batten really likes. So I'm going to see if I can skip to the next. This is an OETA special that ran maybe a month or so ago. I'm going to see if this will play. So if you don't hear audio, let me know, and I'll see if I can get my mouse to work. There it is. Let me try this, if this will work now.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't hear any audio from that. I'll see if I can figure it out on our end.
Okay, you're not hearing it at all?
Correct.
Okay. I'm not sure. Is there anything I need to do on my side?
Let me see. I'm troubleshooting right now to see how we can do that. Let's see.
So
I
while we're
think,
while
oh,
we're
I'm sorry. If you click share in the top right corner of your screen when you share your screen, there
Mhm.
should be a toggle that says include computer sound, like a switch to turn that on, and that
Okay.
should share your computer sound.
Okay, let me see this. When I do share and it does that, I'm not seeing it.
Let me
Oh, here
see.
it is. More
Yeah,
audio.
include
Okay.
sound. That should.
Sorry about that. Let me see if there's something else I can do here. Oh, here it is. Include sound. Yes. Okay. Sorry. Let's try it again. Operator error. Okay. Ready? Here we go.
The Choctaw Tribe is using $1.9
Perfect.
million from the federal grant to purchase drones and robotics to retrieve vital health data and records from remote areas of Oklahoma and deliver them to where they are needed. Steve Shaw took a trip to Pittsburgh County this week and joins us now with his report. Steve.
Rich, Choctaw Nation is Oklahoma's first Native American tribe to use drones and robotics for medical purposes. They say it would change the way healthcare is delivered in rural areas.
Choctaw Nation finished what they call their Emerging Aviation Technology Center on Daisy Ranch about a year ago. They convinced the U.S. Department of Transportation that they're on the cusp of an unmanned drone and robot system capable of delivering medical test samples between medical clinics throughout Choctaw Nation.
In these smaller areas, these smaller clinics, if there's a test that the doctor orders that we don't offer in-house, we have to send that out to our reference lab. And if we do that, the results will not return to the doctor's hands for 2 to 3 days. So he's basing his treatment on guesswork at that point. What's wrong with this patient? He doesn't really know. He's got the signs and symptoms from the patient, but he doesn't have the test results in his hand.
Choctaw Nation Laboratory Director Jason Manifold says the future is here.
A drone would provide us a means to take that sample from the smaller locations, such as at our Atoka clinic, our Hugo clinic, and transport them to a larger clinic, such as McAllister, Durant, Tallahena Hospital, Podo, Idabel. And those clinic locations offer a larger testing menu. So we'll be able to test that specimen on the same day that it is collected from our patients, and those results will be back into our provider's hands the same day.
Instead of humans, these things will hand off and pick up those medical samples.
Dog drone will take the sample from the aircraft, and it will bring it to the laboratory. Now, right now we have it set up to where it bring it up to the front door of the clinic, but eventually, from what I understand, they will have access actually into the laboratory. So the dog will actually walk into the lab, hand off the specimen. If we have a specimen to send back, we'll be able to give it back to the dog. The dog will take it back, load it into the drone, and we can send the drone on its way to where it needs to go.
What are they going to think of next?
I do not know, but I tell you what, if you would have told me 25 years ago when I started off in this business, the laboratory, that I'd be sitting here talking to you about a drone system that would transport specimens back and forth from clinic to clinic, I'd said you're crazy.
Choctaw Nation's Advanced Technology Initiatives Director, James Grimsley, says drone technology has been around since World War I.
So we have pretty deep roots. Interesting thing is Marilyn Monroe was discovered working in a drone factory in World War II because the U.S. military built a lot of drones as targets for their gunners to do. So they built these small radio-controlled aircraft that were essentially drones.
You're being serious?
Yes, very serious. So she was discovered, an Army Times photographer went through the factory and was doing a story about the drones. I thought that was a neat story.
Grimsley says the fact so many people die each year on rural roadways also plays into this.
I'm a former transportation commissioner. I've dealt with the rural highway problem in southeast Oklahoma. I know what the challenges are, the safety challenges are, the funding issues, what the horizon looks like. We must look at these new modes of transportation to solve some of those sort of increasing reliance, and we have to figure out how we curb that demand for the roadways, because we're not going to have the money to continually build and fix like we have in the past. It's dangerous to be on a rural highway. You're twice as likely to die in a fatality accident, and there are a lot of reasons for that. The roads are not quite up to the levels we need to be, but also you're farther from trauma centers, you're farther from a lot of things.
Alyssa Sharp lives in Tuscahoma in rural Pushmataha County.
Yeah, it's takes about an hour and 30 minutes, if not more, for an ambulance to get to my house. Unfortunately, we've tested it.
She says drone technology can't get to her fast enough.
As a mother, it is so exciting because of where I live. You know, snakes are always an issue. So being able to get some sort of medicine or something that would help me if my son got bit.
Choctaw Nation can earn as much as $15 million in federal grants over the next several years if their advanced healthcare logistics program succeeds.
Very excited about that. If our testing phase pans out to be beneficial, which is our next phase, and we can prove that, then we'll be eligible for the next step in funding, and which will be the $15 million.
Lots of things are converging. We see generational shifts. We see in terms of how we look at technology, how we accept it. But we're seeing things like automation, AI, all of these things are coming together where we will be able to do things incredibly safely, incredibly more efficient. We'll be able to put the guardrails around this technology so it doesn't do the things we don't want it to do, but we can exploit those benefits that we see already that are going to be possible.
How many years down the road are we talking this is actually going to happen?
I predict that we're going to see quite a bit of this in reality by 2030. There are so many things that are aligning for that. The regulatory system is aligning. We'll see a lot happen with the FAA regulatory system this year.
One of the end goals for Choctaw Nation is to eventually be able to send medications to people's homes and even accident sites in rural parts of the Sooner State.
If I can get it to advance. There we go. So what I want to do is I'll wrap up here quickly because I'd like to get into conversation. I love Q&A. So growing up in the reservation, this is a story I like to tell. So growing up in rural Atoka County in the 60s and 70s, my connection to the outside world was limited. We had a very small library. It didn't take long to read all the books in our little local library. We had a couple of television stations that mostly worked. You know, it's the thing about you'd have to get your brother to go send out and rotate the antenna and stuff and hope the weather's good. You had newspapers, but you didn't really have that much connection with the outside world. It's interesting that, you know, living in a first world country, our connection real time was either television or, you know, the telephone lines and radio. But really the communication network was copper, if you think about it. And so we had this massive investment of copper in the air and in the ground. My dad actually worked for Southwestern Bell and eventually AT&T. So, you know, he's blue collar at the time, but we were affluent given kind of where the area was at that time. But What's interesting is in less than my lifetime, by the time I was in college, when we started to see cell networks really start to take off and start to be built out, up until the time I finished my graduate degree and things like that, we saw a situation where anyone in the remote part of the world, especially as we saw the internet start to take shape, anyone that has a smartphone that's connected to the internet and connected to a cell network has access to the knowledge of the history of mankind. So basically, all the knowledge that has ever existed fits in their hand now, and it's easily accessible. And even the most wealthy, most powerful person on the planet, back in when I was a young kid in Atoka County, didn't have that. And I don't think we've fully comprehended the full impact of that. What this means for our future. I believe technology can leapfrog, just the same way we did with access to information, communication. We can use technology to leapfrog in rural areas, remote areas, and address other things. And one of the big areas that we have to focus on, because it's the big domain that's still yet to be really kind of broken, is that transportation part, where we can more reliably, more efficiently, and more fairly democratize access to the airspace, but also democratize and make this type of stuff more available. This is how we're going to tackle the problems, because it's great quality of life otherwise in a rural area. So much of our culture, so much of our history, so many things we want to protect, and we believe we can solve these other problems that we have. So with that, I'll go ahead and open it. I have a few more slides. If there are questions, I can just show some details of what we're doing, but I'd like to start and see if anyone has questions. And I'll stop sharing so I can watch the chat. How's that?
Yeah, if anyone has questions, please feel free to type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and you can unmute yourself and ask the question vocally as well.
And if I don't know the answer, I have ChatGPT. I'll make one up real fast.
We do have a question in the chat. Would you like me to read it out, or I can
Yes,
do
I'm
that
seeing
if
it
you
right
like?
here. So the question is, how can emerging aviation technology such as uncrewed aerial systems and advanced air mobility be scaled sustainably in rural tribal communities while addressing regulatory infrastructure, workforce challenges to ensure the long-term safety and improved healthcare access? So that's a really good question, because there's multiple layers of that. A lot of my time, I'll kind of work backwards from the regulatory part of it. A lot of my time over the past, I'd say, decade to 15 years has been focused on the regulatory side of things, because we've started out, we didn't have enabling rules. At OU, we had one of the first COAs to fly drones in the airspace, and it had to be treated like a very large aircraft. It was a 5-pound foam drone, but we had to get relief from the rules that were the same ones that applied to things like 737s. And so it was a very difficult thing. And so a lot of us had been working on that enabling regulation. But if you look at a lot of things that we've justified the rulemaking, it's addressing rural problems. Like on Part 108, we'll probably see the final Part 108 rule come out this year. I actually led the part of the Aviation Rulemaking Committee that had to address what's the social benefit. We have to say there's a social benefit before we go through a regulatory rulemaking process. And the example that we used and documented in that actually was used to justify it is a delivery of EpiPens. That in remote areas, sometimes you don't have access or immediate access, and that if we can deliver those more quickly in an emergency situation, we could save lives. And that's actually the example that was used to justify all the effort that's been put into rulemaking. But the infrastructure, there's a lot of things that are converging that are going to help us, because a lot of the infrastructure that we're going to need in the future for low altitude UAS operations, a lot of that infrastructure is sort of coming along with, as we do things like rural broadband, as we build out all the rural cell networks and things like that. It's sort of coming along with that, and almost happening as we're figuring out new ways we leverage those other types of infrastructure to support it. Certain things like advanced air mobility, that there's multiple layers of that. If you look at the pure electric, the eVTOL, obviously charging is an issue, having grid capacity. Also with the pure electric AAM, the challenge there is range. We don't necessarily have the range with a battery-powered electric only. That's why we're seeing a little bit of a shift in some parts of the industry where we're looking at hybrids. If you think about it, had we not had 20, 25 years, however many years we've had of Toyota Priuses, it would have been a whole lot more difficult to build a supply chain network and build the capabilities to do Teslas. And so hybrid is an evolutionary engineering step. Sometimes it makes sense rather than to jump to battery only. It makes sense to say, let's do hybrid so we can eliminate some of the challenges and barriers we have. And so that's still playing out. I think what it's going to feel like if you were to experience the next year to 2 years, it's going to feel like drones are really taking off in the next couple of years, where it may feel like AAM and advanced air mobility stalling out a little bit. And part of that is the regulatory, but also part of it's that infrastructure we're going to need. But we are working. I just finished leading a group at the FAA where we're looking at what's called electronic conspicuity. What does the future look like? How do we make every aircraft visible in the air electronically so that we can control, track, deal with issues, safety issues, do things like detect and avoid. So there's some pretty serious efforts going on to address it. But a lot of these benefits that we do see are disproportionate for rural areas. A lot of the quality of life, quality of health issues are disproportionately beneficial to the rural areas. And so we're going to be focusing very heavily on that. Choctaw Nation, in our mind, we're building the path. We're laying the groundwork for that. We are sort of the model of what the tribal nations and rural communities will look like in the future. So we're kind of blazing that trail right now. And our hope is our journey as we do this, as we're actually building the blueprint for what rural communities will look like. But very good question. So thank you. So I'm surprised nobody asked, how many drone dogs do we have, right? So we own one, and they're pretty neat. We have a very talented and great person in Oklahoma that works with Aviation Robotics. He's actually from Northeast Oklahoma. And Brent McLaughlin is Aviation is part of our team, but Brent himself has been a great friend of the tribe. So we own one of the dogs and we're leasing two right now. So we have two that we're leasing as part of the SMART program. But we're finding other uses for those drone dogs as well. So there's going to be interesting interplay between ground robotics and then drones that are, in a sense, an aerial robot. So we're seeing some neat things in the future. We do have a hand up. Ethan, go ahead.
Oh, hi, James. Thanks. I really enjoyed the presentation. I hope that that'll be available to the attendees. So I think the information was wonderful. And I really appreciate you going back and kind of giving the history of the Choctaw Nation and how this all came about. Question, you hear a lot about the Amazon delivery of packages. I'm just wondering, are you hearing anything similar out of the U.S. Postal Service? And the reason I ask that is I know they have the big training center in Norman, and I'm just wondering if that's if you're hearing that through your circles, if that's coming.
Yeah, the kind of two parts of that question. The Postal Service has looked at it. I think they've done some intense studies. As you know, the Postal Service a lot of times is looking at its long term. What does the post office look like long term? You know, in an area where we may be receiving less physical mail versus everything being electronic stuff. I think they've looked at it. I think it becomes a little bit more interesting when you're looking at the post office, because if you think about the post office, sort of goes beyond just mail delivery. It serves a lot of different functions. And I could see that happening. There's a lot of things, the creative things. We've even had some ideas over the years about how we could work with the post office. And I'm saying I mean the entire industry, building on the network they already have. I think they've been looking at it. I don't know whether they have any immediate plans. I'm not aware of any immediate near-term plans. I think what will happen is a lot of groups like that will be looking at the infrastructure maturity as it's built out. So what if you think about the Choctaw Nation? So if we said we're going to deliver cookies and ice cream, right? And it's hard to justify building out the safety infrastructure for putting in radar, we're putting in communication networks, all those things. It's hard to justify that expenditure if we're doing luxury or convenience items, right? But healthcare absorbs costs in a different way. We can justify it. If you've ever had to pay for a medical helicopter ride, that's very expensive. And when you look at the things we can do with drones at a fraction of some of the cost of how we do it right now in healthcare, very attractive. But it may not be ready to deliver ice cream, or if you want, a bag of chips from whatever, it may not be there yet. But that infrastructure that we're building for those sectors that absorb it right now, that can actually justify it, will be that same infrastructure that we can use later on. So what will happen is we build it out to address these immediate healthcare, safety, first response type needs, what'll happen is that same network is going to enable more regular commerce. And so it could be that the post office or the postal service looks at it and says, so when we get that sufficient nationwide, we can become a big user of it and maybe become a customer of some of those services that that infrastructure part of it. So I think a lot of people are looking at it. Obviously, UPX and FedEx, I've worked a lot with them. They're looking at it very heavily. Interestingly enough, back in 2011, one of the first national level interviews I did with the press, they said, well, what are all these UAS or UAVs going to be used for? And one of the situations I laid out at the time, as I talked about, well, it's perfect for rural logistics, small package deliveries, mail, things like that. And this was a couple of years before Amazon. And so fortunately, when Jeff Bezos came out and started talking about it, there was one reporter that wrote an article. He said, there was a guy in Oklahoma talking about this a couple of years ago. So anyway, did get some credit for that. But there's a lot of things will happen once we get that basic infrastructure in place. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but I do think we'll have a lot of different agencies, a lot of different industries start to utilize this once we get the regulatory system in place and once we get that stable infrastructure network in place.
Great. Thanks, James. And if you don't mind, just a separate question also on counter UAS. I was up in Lawton last month for their counter UAS forum, which was very good. And I'm just wondering if that's something in your roadmap for your test center, not only delivery, but also the encounter technology.
Yes, it very much is. Certain things I obviously can't talk about, publicly, but I did serve on the Aviation Rulemaking Committee for that. The FAA did one, and then have been involved with some of the other agencies and stuff on this. It's a difficult challenge. If you look overseas, what's happening? Drones have changed warfare. It's totally changed, but it also has changed what non-state actors can do. And it doesn't take billions or trillions of dollars to develop a pretty lethal capability, is what we're seeing happen around the world right now. So counter UAS is going to be extremely important, even more important. And it's just a reality. When we get our engineering degrees, all of us as engineers, we don't go to school, work hard, and do all this stuff, say, how can we be destructive to society, right? We always are thinking about all the good things. But the reality is that there typically is many, maybe not more people trying to figure out how to do things out of malice and find malicious ways to do that. So it's always going to be a challenge that as we figure out new ways to do things that benefit society, somebody's going to try to figure out how to use that. And those guardrails are always going to be important. There are things that we're looking at in the United States that will help us. Right now, we really have three scenarios. When somebody does something bad with the drone, we call it clueless, careless, or criminal. Sometimes people just don't know what they're doing. They don't follow FAA rules. They may not even know about the FAA rules, and they just go buy a drone and do something dumb, right? And so that's the careless and the clueless. The college student that says, I want to go fly my drone over the stadium and get a good picture of the football game. They don't understand the severity of what they do. But then there's the criminal, and the criminal sometimes is harder. It's harder to detect. It's hard to work with. But there are significant efforts underway in the United States right now. A lot of agencies are looking at it, and there's a lot of work happening right now. It's very important. Counter UAS will always, it's going to come right along with how we're doing the innovation. On the innovation side, as long as we're innovating and pushing the envelope there, we're going to have to be doing the same thing with counter UAS. That's just the unfortunate reality of the world we live in. But yeah, a lot of good stuff. I think we have one more hand up. Go ahead, Don.
Hey, James. That was a great presentation and great overview of the Choctaw Nation technology advancement. I'm with Aerospace Mechanical Engineering at OU, and you mentioned a few challenges with Choctaw Nation. Transportation transit. We're actually doing this project with Atoka on the autonomous vehicle deployment. But my question is more on the broader integration of the drone-based delivery of medical supplies you were talking about with the other multimodal transportation systems. For example, highway freight networks. For example, if you want to get something from Port of Long Beach in California to Atoka, you might have to go through the corridor of I-40, and then I-35, and all the way to the local communities. How do you think these can be integrated and thought about in a comprehensive way?
Very good question, because I think there are a lot of problems that we can begin to solve that way. If you think about it, and this is something I was very keenly interested in as a commissioner, because I was looking at all these different things where we're working with, how do we incentivize? How do we facilitate? If you don't mind, I'll go back a little bit philosophically, and this is a fallacy of humans. Whenever something new pops up, we usually start out by not describing what it does. We try to describe it as what it's not, right? And so what happened with automobiles when we first started, the turn of the 19th century, was we call them horseless carriages. There's a story I tell in some of my presentations. The biggest transportation crisis for municipalities in the 1890s was that horse manure problem. That you can imagine having 300,000 horses in New York City, what that would do, and it was like a crisis. It was to the level that they were having international conferences about it, and they were ignoring automobiles because they thought automobiles as a solution would scare the horses, and they were so centric on horses that they were still revolved around that. And then when we saw automobiles become democratized with Henry Ford and production lines and things like that, where automobiles were affordable, that fell by the wayside. But the same thing has happened. One of the things that happened, you notice we call things driverless automobiles. We call it unmanned or unpiloted aircraft. We still describe things and what they're missing. What happens is we always approach things by trying to bolt it on to either our existing understanding or bolt it onto our existing regulatory system. So what we have started out doing, and I think this is a mistake, I think we always start out by saying, how do we make these new things behave according to the rules that we have and the laws that we have? And in reality, we can expect different things out of automated technology. If you're thinking about automated vehicles on the road, why do they need to follow the motor codes when we can give them their own rules, give them their own laws that says that you have to be more predictable? We can make them behave in a way that we know that they can because we have that consistency in operation and prediction how they operate, but we can force them to operate in ways that makes it safer for all of us. And so the same thing with trucking. One of the things I was always intrigued with is the ability, what tools do we have to incentivize those types of things that lead to better efficiency, better use of our roadways, all sorts of things, better safety, less accidents and stuff. And I've always thought about, why do we always have to have an 80,000-pound semi? Well, if you think about it, operators are expensive. That becomes the liability. They can only drive so many hours a day. It's expensive. If you did have platoons that either have maybe one driver and lots of different vehicles following them that are automated, or you have a totally automated platoon, why do they need to always be 80,000 pounds? Maybe you could have multiple that are 40,000 and stuff. And if we can begin to cut down those weights, there's one of the biggest things that tears up a highway or roadway is weight. If you have very, very large, heavily loaded trucks and stuff, it does a lot of damage. And so I think there's ways that we can look at it in the future, maybe take our blinders off and say, what if we incentivize these platoons to drive on the nights? Maybe we say there's a benefit if you're going to have a platoon and you're moving these automated trucks, travel at night when we have less traffic, incentivize them in some way, give them accommodations on speed limit or something. But there may be ways that we can incentivize behavior that might pull daytime truck traffic off, or daytime traffic may be more efficiently allocated between night and day, but also maybe cut down on the weight. So I think there's very creative opportunities in the future if we start to do that. Interestingly enough, is a lot of the infrastructure we need for automated vehicles and connected vehicles, stuff like that, is very similar to what we need for low altitude aviation. And so we start to build things that actually serve multiple purposes. And so it's a very good idea. I hope we start to see those boundaries. I'm actually been pushing a lot of my friends that are in the regulatory space as we do rulemaking. Usually we always look at ground transportation with strict walls. We look at aviation, and we don't ever look across those domains to look at common risks or things. And what happens is we become very risk averse in aviation, but we don't look at the impacts of what if we don't act fast enough, if we don't broaden our risk aperture in aviation. Maybe we can solve some of these problems on the ground if we amend our regulatory stuff in the aviation. So I've been pushing that we really have a more holistic view of risk with transportation, because historically we have not. We've always separated the two. Bringing the whole idea of the value of statistical life and the things that's used in ground transportation over aviation was kind of a first step to say, why don't we think like that? Why don't we think about the cost of not acting fast enough, or the cost of not adopting a little bit more risk in the air, because we may offset a bigger risk on the ground. So there's a lot of cultural things, within the regulatory system and the way we think we're working on right now. But it's a very good idea. I think transportation costs, if we ever had a period in our future where we have very high energy cost, it would force a lot of those things to happen, because that becomes another constraint that we have to work into all the other constraints, and we would have to become far more efficient on these things. But very good question. I think there's going to be some neat opportunities in the next decade on that cross-domain, multi-domain use of technology like that.
Thank you.
All right, we have a few minutes left. Last call for questions if anyone has any. If not, or if anyone has any follow-up questions, is it okay if anyone emails you afterwards if they have
Sure.
any questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll put my email right now in the chat so you can see my email address. Hopefully did I type that correctly? Yes, I did. I did forget at the beginning because I was switching between calls. The Choctaw word for hello, the greeting, is halito. So I missed saying that, but halito on behalf of the Choctaw Nation. And then like a lot of indigenous languages, we don't really, saying goodbye was considered bad. It's like a curse, and so there's not really clear goodbyes. And so it's more along the lines, if you look at a lot of the languages, it's until we meet again, or things like that. We typically use yakoki, which means thank you. It's sort of along the lines of until we meet again. So on behalf of the Choctaw Nation, yakoki for your interest in what we're doing. We're very proud of what's happening. I'm immensely proud of the Choctaw Nation, having grown up there. And I'm very fortunate the leadership has trusted me to come in and explore some of these things. And it's been a neat time, neat environment. And we're hoping that we can do things for society at large. But we appreciate everyone's time here. Please stay involved in these emerging technologies. We need everyone involved. We need all the stakeholders to think creatively about the future. We have a lot of problems to solve, but we're going to have a lot of ideas and a lot of tools and a lot of opportunities. And so I see it as the glass half full. We have a lot of things we're going to be able to do, and I'm really excited about it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like to offer a virtual round of applause for Mr. Grimsley. Amazing presentation. And as you said, until we meet again, hopefully sometime soon, so we can get an update on how the technology is progressing. Very exciting stuff. So
Absolutely.
Thank you again. We'll be sending out a survey. Please look out for that. And again, thank you so much to our wonderful speaker, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Take care.